Oh, there we go. Welcome back. We're in the middle of chapter 11, right? Now, chapter 11, the actual, if I were to write it out, is aggregate and material requirements planning. Last time I only wrote aggregate planning because that's all that we worked on. Today we have one other major item from aggregate planning, the idea of math programs. So we'll take a look at that. And we're going to move on to the beginning of this thing that's known as MRP, material requirements planning. We'll just quickly review what it's all about, MRP inputs, and we might start on one of those input bill of materials. Anyway, here's our agenda. Oh, right, so today EQS 5 is still open. And Dave, when you have a moment, if we could get the program on the monitor. But before we actually get back into chapter 11, which notice, it's a pretty chunky chapter. I believe you guys got a robo email from me today, right? Come on, computer. Concerning, I thought that I would just briefly mention this also in class about an alternate exam 3 time, right? This document that it refers to is in the top of the document section, and it looks like this. So 1,000 apologies to everybody in Singapore, because you got the email too. And right, this is only a bit of flexibility that applies to Buffalo. And our excuse is it's not an excuse. There's 5 times as many people in Buffalo as you guys in Singapore. And SIM is much better, Singapore Institute of Management, much better at scheduling exams than apparently we are here on the North Campus. Because yes, I know quite a few people, when you're looking on the hub and you see our May 14th, 3:30 p.m. exam session for the 3rd exam, you have a conflict. So what we've done is we got a room reservation for Knox 20, the big auditorium, for the Friday evening before. So take a moment just this time of the semester, look at your exam schedule. And if you're seeing a problem on your exam schedule, then contact Jasmina if this solution will work for you, right, to make a reservation for this is an alternate optional early exam on Friday. This is actually the reason that when you look at the syllabus, you might have noticed that the last day of class on Thursday, May 9th, doesn't have any subject. It just says something like review and, right, because from the beginning I'd planned on doing absolutely nothing new, essentially finishing the material by Tuesday. We'll use Thursday, just to look at some redundant examples, but I wanted to make it spongy in case for the people who were then turning right around and taking the exam on Friday. So we will, in this class, and we have planned on this beginning, actually finish all of the material as of the end of the Tuesday of that week. Did that make any sense? Yeah? Okay. So I just wanted to draw this to your attention. Generally, we've had to do this for the past couple years, and generally this has not booked full. There's usually been about 200 people that had conflicts, and we could hold up to 228. But that's a forecast based on past data. We never know, right, from one semester to the next. So I encourage you, if you're interested in this session, to let us know soon to get your name on the list. Okay, so that's it for administrative announcements. What is it that we were actually working on? Oh, you know what? Why don't we do a bit of a recap? Because we are actually into some rather important material that doesn't go away. It's not just in chapter 11. You say, what? What is it that doesn't go away? So what is it that we did on Tuesday? We talked about aggregate planning strategies, right? We talked about chasing demand. We talked about leveling production. And actually, we're going to go on and talk more in detail about how you put together those plans, because those are kind of in our wheelhouse in operations. We had mentioned, and I'm standing in front of the phrase, we had mentioned a third strategy, that if you're trying to cope with changing demand on your system, you could also try leveling demand. We just had a little discussion on it, of which that's not precisely in our wheelhouse in operations. We just noted various ways that companies do it. And as a closing thought on that third category, before we go on and investigate the other first two categories in detail, I thought I would point out this really interesting example that somebody sent to me actually some years ago. So you folks in Singapore, my apologies if they have upgraded this particular ERP gantry. This is a photo that someone took on their phone. They were in traffic on the Pan Island Expressway in Singapore. This gantry here locally, does this look familiar to you guys? What is this? It's toll, right? This is the electronic road pricing system. This is an example of leveling demand. We had said that the single most powerful tool in leveling demand generally is changing customer pricing. Who is interested in it? Systems, right, organizations that have distinctly limited capacity but have wildly cycling demand for that capacity. And actually, city streets are a good example of that, because you can't temporarily make city streets wider or narrower. I mean, there's just no such thing. And yet people want to drive on them in certain times of the day, right? Rush hour, we say. And other times of the day, they can be underutilized. Now, this, okay, so you say, big deal. That just looks like, what is it, Easy Pass here, right, in Western New York. You see that everywhere. Most of the time when you see it, you don't see it the way that they're using it in Singapore. Easy Pass here in New York, like you go over the Grand Island Bridge, or over in Ontario, the 407, is not exactly being used to level demand. And here's the difference. Very interesting set of photos. Let me forward it. Let's look at a different expressway, because most major roads in Singapore are governed this way. This is from an overpass, the CTE in Singapore. And the person had waited to send me this photo. Do you see the time? 9:59 p.m. See this bright line? It's being projected by the gantry. You have to look at the photo for a minute to realize what this was like in person. See, these are all brake lights. Everybody here, the traffic is quite compact, has actually gone from expressway speeds to slowing down as much as possible without basically illegally parking on the expressway. That's what this in the foreground is. Why have they done that? Now look at the top of the gantry and what it says. Because this is the photo that they took at 10:01 p.m. The photo is darker because the cars are moving faster and there's the light is not building up like from all the headlights, because everybody has taken off again and is at speed. Everybody see why that rather strange behavior? They're using pricing, differential pricing, to encourage people to drive during non-peak periods. The toll dropped there at the top at 10 p.m. And everybody knew that. That's why at 9:59, right, everybody's like, oh, I don't want to cross because you get charged right there. Don't want to cross, you know, phooey. And then, so we use this type of technology to collect tolls off of vehicles. We generally do not vary the tolls, which is to say we're kind of collecting for use of the road, but we're not attempting to level demand. This is a direct attempt to level demand, charge you more during peak periods, charge you less during quiet periods. So maybe you'll think about not driving during peak periods and instead driving during quiet periods, and the roads will be more evenly used. Singapore was one of the, on the cutting edge of this. For you guys in London, which I think you're going to be coming back from London pretty soon. You know, we had a couple students in London. London does this now at the city center. They have a congestion fee that they charge if you try to drive in the city center during peak periods. They visited Singapore to get that idea. That's actually where they got it from some years ago. So this is just a very vivid example of leveling demand. Having looked at that example, we're now going to turn away from leveling demand and we're going to look at the two more operational strategies of chasing demand and leveling production. Now, in the spirit of a recap, I wanted to point something out. From Tuesday, I just put together a slide, so we don't have to go back over our notes. Remember we were drawing graphs? And I actually clipped this out of the book. It's not the exact same example, but it's very, very similar. This graph in the book looks very similar to the one that we drew for the level production strategy. And we had noted that if you had done a chart and had already calculated cumulative demand and cumulative production in order to create the chart, then it's very easy to figure out inventory levels, right? Because it's just cumulative production minus cumulative demand. But if you hadn't, right, then it's probably easier to use inventory logic, and I clipped that straight out of the book. That's the expression I wrote on the board for ending inventory. If you're trying to figure out in a given period, if we do this, like how much of that stuff has actually accumulated, well, we can calculate that with logic. Your ending inventory is your beginning inventory plus any production minus any demand. In other words, it's logic. How much you end up with is how much you begin with plus anything you add that period minus anything that got used. Oh, right, and where are you going to get beginning inventory from? We noted that these things tend to be a daisy chain, and we're going to work with this today. Your ending inventory for a certain period is basically your beginning inventory for the next period, because what you end with at the end of one day is what you begin with at the beginning of the next day. Oh, yeah, okay, got that. Matter of fact, pretty sure you've seen that in another class. The reason that I'm recapping this with this slide is I just wanted to point out one little intricacy. And that is that out there, not everybody agrees that ending inventory is a good way to assess a plan, because that's why we're calculating ending inventory, to see whether we'd want to do this or not. Is that a lot of inventory or a little bit of inventory? There's another school of thought that if you want to calculate the inventory burden on a system, you should use average inventory, not ending inventory. Okay, well, average inventory is very easy to calculate. This is the expression I clipped from the book, but you see what you're averaging? For a certain period T, like a certain month, like July. What's the average inventory? You average together the beginning and the ending inventory for July. That's what the average is. Beginning inventory plus ending inventory divided by 2. Oh, all right. Now, why did I make up a slide about this? And why am I going on about this? Just don't confuse the two. Okay? They're similar, but they're not the same thing. Okay? So it's just sort of a practical matter. If you're like working a problem and it asks you what's the ending inventory, we're talking about this. If it asks you what's the average inventory, they sound similar. We're talking about this. But we recognize that distinction from the beginning. You will notice that most of the time here in class, we're working with ending inventory. I find that it's the most intuitive, you know, especially at the beginning, to motivate people's recognition, because it is actually a measurement of a certain condition at a particular time. You are left with that much stuff. Now, any questions on that distinction? Ending versus average? Okay, well, actually, let's go back to our problem. This is the one that I clipped from the book. It's certainly neater than my graph. It wasn't exactly the same numbers. No, my graphs looked like this. Right, we graphed a proposed chase demand strategy. You can recognize it because there's not a lot of inventory. It doesn't look too terribly different from cumulative demand. And then there was our level production strategy. It also had a little bit of outage in it. These two strategies, this one moving forward, I mean, the idea is we are going to live these next 6 months. Which one of these should we use? Because we only need one plan, and I've given you 2. How many people like the chase strategy? I'm querying the room. Okay, we've got a nod. 2, 3, versus this. Everybody else like that? Okay, we're getting some nods. And actually, it's up to you how to vote. I kind of like this one in that I do sort of intuitively shy away from the fact that we have an outage here. But you know what? I have no idea how important it is that we had an outage. It may be that outage is for what, and there's no context here, right? Or like no big deal. We can't actually, you're free to pick between these 2, just whichever one you think looks the best, because we don't have any further information about the options. This strategy is attractive because there's no outages, but it does, for instance, contain an epic moment where we go from this month, we don't do anything. We've shut down and gone on vacation. And then the following month, this steep line is us producing at record levels. And we don't have any information on how we would pull that off or what that would cost. And I had just mentioned we don't have any information about whether that's truly costly or not. And we also don't have any information about how inconvenient it is to store up inventory. We don't here. But if you turn the page, that's where we start to add that information. What we've been doing is working our way, this is no page 108, towards a sort of, you could think of it as a full-blown MRP problem, or excuse me, aggregate planning problem. In aggregate planning, you have to have a forecast. So for instance, here's a forecast, and you have to have information on what your options are. Oh, so this is just a list. There's not even any context. But I can see that one of our options is varying the size of the workforce. I can see that because it's priced. So apparently it's something that we could choose from. I notice that we also have the option, if we're thinking we're going to be really, really busy, of working overtime, because I see a price offered for that. Apparently, this is something tangible that we can hold in inventory, because inventory is an option. And if we wanted to pursue a level schedule, remember, that's actually the option that we're exercising. Okay, this is still information here concerning overtime, right? How much regular time, how much overtime. And that is still about the workforce there. And we have 7 people. That's still about the workforce. This information, the only thing we want to do is work out a plan. And I'm sure you're not surprised that most aggregate planning, we can dismiss the slide for now, really lends itself to spreadsheet models. This is from UB Learns, and this is all that same information, set up a spreadsheet. Because I just need a plan, right? This is the forecast right here. I could, for instance, just say, you know what, I'm going to chase demand in regular time. So what I did was I pasted the forecast into the regular time row. And all this stuff recalculated. Matter of fact, a little bit of conditional formatting is warning something here about if you do that regular time. So let me see what the problem is, my idea of, well, let's just work regular time and then let's just produce exactly what we need. That right there, regular time hours, month 4. We don't have enough people to do that. That's what it means. You'd need 1,200 hours. And this is where a spreadsheet's very, very convenient, because it's just calculating it. Yeah, sure, if you wanted to produce 1,200 units, you'd need 1,200 hours, right? You only have, based on the 7 people that it told us about, 1,120 regular hours available in a month. So that's not going to work. So that invites me to figure out, all right, well, what could I do maybe to fix that problem? I could, for instance, maybe hire another person, or maybe we could work overtime. Now I'm working with the options. Notice what I did first, though. I picked a strategy. I was just suggesting. Now, I have no idea, actually, if chasing demand is, in fact, the way that we want to go. This particular spreadsheet, if you're interested, we can experiment with, right, it's calculating, for instance, the total cost of the plan. Ooh, I think that would work. If we hired another person, I just put it one person for hire, we've got 8 people, then we would have enough people to do the plan that I made up, and it would cost us $50,000. We'd like that number to be as small as possible. Let's see, this worked when I tested it on Tuesday. This spreadsheet has been set up as an optimization model. This is Solver that comes free with Excel. If with your Excel you don't see Solver under data, it's because it's an add-in and you haven't added it in. Now, what is it? It is a means of explaining to a second piece of software that I'm trying to make that number as small as possible. I'm worried about the fact that there's a limited amount of regular hours, a limited amount of overtime hours. Here are all the costs. I'm just asking the Solver engine to find me the lowest cost schedule, and that's interesting. The lowest cost schedule, my guess was pretty good. Must have been my memory. It didn't move off of regular time. Do you see that? I had hired the person here. It just happens to have cleaned it up and hired them when they were needed. But it's saying, well, okay, actually, based on all that information that's listed in your note frame, this is the lowest cost answer. Okay, this is the lowest cost answer or the optimal solution. All right, now, before we move forward, let me clarify. We're going to recognize this as the lowest cost answer. I'm not going to ask you anything on an exam about how to set up Solver in Excel. It is software that came free with Excel. It's in your computer probably, of which you could ask it to find the best answer to situations. I'm happy actually to talk about how you do this in office hours. And if you're interested in this, this is the type of model building that you'd get into in more detail in, for instance, MGO303 and 304. The 2 advanced operations classes that are electives in the curriculum. You could do more work this way. Or especially, I think it's MGO, and I'm doing this from memory. Is it MGO 363? I should have checked. There's an operations analytics class in the fall. And I'm just saying, if you thought, ooh, how'd you do that? I want to do that. Okay, actually, there's a class you could take. We're just going to say, that's the best thing to do given we've scientifically confirmed. So I'm going to copy this to my grid in the note frame. It is a perfect 600. Switch to the visualizer. We hire a person right here in month 4 when we need them. We don't have any overtime. It didn't use any overtime. And notice we don't have any ending inventory. The total cost of the plan, according to Solver, you could fiddle with all those options listed above in the spreadsheet, and you cannot beat this number. It's just a flat $50,000 to cover the next 6 months. Now, this is a plan, and this is an important capacity. We should be able to describe this plan. This is described as a perfect chase demand strategy with regular time. Right? Because that is basically all we're using, regular time. We just had to hire a person to get the regular time to work. Perfect chase demand means this, look at the top, is the same thing as the forecast. Whatever is needed, that is exactly what we're planning to use. Okay, so we have a plan. Now, I want to point something out. Come on, computer. What the computer did, right? The only thing actually from my demonstration that Solver did was it sort of neatened up my plan because I had guessed well. I had put in the same numbers for regular time, but I had just hired the person right away because I knew that we were short at least one person, and that worked. So I just restored that plan. Do you guys notice that the total cost of the plan didn't change? Oh, so what we copied in our notes is an optimal solution to the plan, but actually my guess at the beginning, it turns out, was also an optimal solution. It's not any more expensive. So mathematically, the way Solver looks at it, it's essentially the same thing. Now wait, think about the ground truth of this. Would this cause you the same degree of expense? You're worried about the next 6 months, right? You know that you're going to need somebody. You really don't need them until the 4th month. But is it the same thing to hire them then when you need them or to hire them in the first? I mean, on the ground truth of that. It does, I mean, well, why would we hire them 2 months earlier than we need them? Well, Solver says, same thing, same. Well, actually, yeah, the way that we described this problem, it is the same thing. But in reality, that's rather suspicious because usually when you hire somebody, there's some minimum commitment for them working, right, for payment. This that we modeled here on, was it no page 108? Okay, it works if you are paying people per piece. Everybody hear that? Which is getting rarer and rarer these days. Which is to say you pay them when they work on something, but if you don't have anything for work on, you don't have as an employer any obligation to them, and then you don't pay them. Generally speaking, that's getting rarer. I would think that when we hired that person, there was some sort of minimum commitment to a work week for them. Wait a minute. The reason that that turned out that way is that I didn't charge us anything for idle time. If you turn to no page 109, that is copy-paste in Word the exact same information. The only thing that is different on this page is a little additional factor that's much more realistic. But suppose you pay $10 per hour of idle regular time. This is this is actually revealing to you what must apparently be in this mythological problem, the base pay rates. Because if you call the person in and they're around for 40 hours a week, you're paying them $10 an hour. It's true, the cost of regular time production is $15, so that additional $5, that must be materials because it takes one person 1 hour to produce 1 unit. All right, well, if we have all the same thing, but this thing we forgot, you know, if you don't use somebody's time, you still pay $10 for it. We can revise this spreadsheet fairly easily because that's calculating the regular time used each week. I'm just going to create a column idle time, which is just what was available minus what actually got used. So I'm seeing that if I hire this person right away, there's over 1,000 hours of idle time in the first month alone. Solver was sort of smart about it and didn't hire them until the 4th month, but there's still a substantial amount of idle time. How am I going to get Solver to account for this? Oh, actually, you know what? Easy. Let me just add a charge to the total cost cell. So I want to say you add up all of that idle time and multiply it by 10 because we're going to pay $10 for each. And what we have is a revised cost of Solver's plan, right? Now I just ask Solver again because it didn't change the structure of the problem. You know, given that you have to pay $10 for the idle time, now what do you think is the best answer? And it changes the plan completely. Wow, what's going on with this plan? You know, the adjusted cost of the current plan used to be 76,000 some odd. Now it's down to 61. And what it's saying is you can now fiddle with all of the options and you can't get a number that's lower than that. But look at what it did to the plan. It's mostly regular time, but those aren't the same numbers. There's inventory, there's hiring, there's layoffs, there's even a little bit of overtime here. It's like using all of the options now. I'm going to jot that down as the revised absolutely perfect answer for this particular problem. And I better be sure to get all of the details correct. 640, 640, 800, 600, overtime of 60 in that peak fourth month, a little bit of overtime. Ending inventory in the first month, we've got quite a bit, 360, and then we use it up and there's nothing at the end of the second month, and then we're up to 340, and then we use that up during the peak period. New hires, there's one just like last time during the peak period. Oh, but we're really manipulating the workforce because one of the things that it does is layoffs. The first month it reduces our workforce by 3, and then the beginning of the 5th month it does it again. The total cost of this plan, 61,600. I'm going to switch to the visualizer. That's just what we were looking at. Remember, this is the exact same data as the page before. And just like the page before, this is the very best answer, even though it looks very different from the answer on the page before, only because of that one statement created the difference between the two of these. What's going on here, we reduce the size of the workforce down to 4 immediately. Remember it says we start with 7? It says what you want to do is reduce to 4 and then hire somebody, but just for this month, because then you lay them off again. Look at the actual production levels, 560, 640, 640, 800 plus 60 in overtime, 860, 600. That is not a level schedule. It's not a perfectly level schedule. A perfectly level schedule would be the same production levels across all of it. But remember I said, you know, an important capacity is if you're looking at somebody's plan is being able to articulate it. What is this? Well, I'm not sure if this is proper grammar, but this is a level-ish plan. This plan is far more level than the one on the page before. These numbers here, we still have a peak, but these numbers, the other 4 months, are very similar to each other. We're producing at a very similar rate across most of this plan, and there's a reason for this. I wanted to induce that result in order to underscore something in your mind. That happened because of this. That statement that I added, you know what that effectively did? That punished us for not utilizing our resources. I mean, in essence, because there was a charge now for idle time. Or maybe the way that when Solver's looking for the best answer, it's being rewarded for figuring out how to utilize the resources as completely as possible. And that's why it was guided towards a much more level plan. Level production strategies, just not this problem on this page, but in general, level production strategies. What is one of the reasons why organizations love them? They naturally yield much higher utilization of resources. Everybody hear that? Because think about it. You pick a certain pace that you're going to produce or provide at, and you perfect your system to be just the right size to produce that, meaning that it is completely utilized at that pace. Level production strategies yield much more heavily utilized resources. The moment I started to charge for not utilizing resources, that's exactly where solver went. Well, then let's level out the plan. These were all the means of leveling out the plan. You see the other things that we're just talking about generally, not just this problem. Level plans mean you're going to build up inventory. Chase plans mean very little inventory. Chase plans, unfortunately, generally mean much lower overall utilization of resources. Any questions on that? Not this, but the spreadsheet model, that is very often how aggregate planning strategies are explored. Build big spreadsheet models, explore them, sometimes with solvers optimization software, sometimes with optimization software, sometimes explore them manually. Oh, explore them manually, right. If we didn't have solver, what is this exercise like? Okay, take those numbers. The forecast. This is note page 110. I just thought, all right, generally speaking, if you cannot rely on solver, what is it you do when you're trying to develop, fill out the grid, develop an aggregate plan? I put note page 110 in here to kind of give you a quick guide. Did you see, even when I was experimenting with the spreadsheet, the first thing that I did was I articulated a strategy? That's actually why we began by talking about strategies. I said, oh, all right, well, why don't we try perfect chase demand, because I can just copy the forecast. That's what you do at the beginning. You say, all right, I'm going to explore, for instance, this is just the example that I worked in my notes, perfect chase demand in regular time by varying the size of the workforce. I'm going to forget that I even experimented with this. So I articulate that. Now, this is going to generate a plan. This is going to generate a plan, but we have no idea if we don't have solver, if it's the very best plan, which is to say, generate the plan. That's step 2, and determine its cost. Because step 4 is just go back, identify another strategy, go through the same steps, and sort of like we were doing with the spreadsheet, see if you can beat that cost. Now, in the one in my notes, this right here, we're being perfectly naive. We're pretending we never saw solver. Well, the filling this part in, how much would you produce? That part is easy because it's perfect chase demand. So you just copy the numbers. We already know that the workforce size of 7 is not absolutely perfect across all of this. What I'm suggesting here is we figure out each month what the perfect workforce size is. It doesn't matter what the strategy is. Then in this is kind of step 2, figuring out how you implement it. There's generally some scratch work if you're not working with a spreadsheet. For instance, let's look at what it said about what somebody can do. The one thing that's nice about this problem for demonstration is one person takes 1 hour to produce 1 unit, so the number of hours is the same thing as the number of units that are produced. If we're working in regular time, that means that each person can provide 160 hours, which means each person can produce 160 units. I just use logic here, step 2, to figure out how many people you would need. In the first month, we want to produce 200. Each person can provide 160, so divide 160 into 200. We're going to get a decimal place. So I am drawing those funny brackets that only have a top and not a bottom, and what they signal in math is round up. Because we weren't offered the opportunity for instance, part-time work, so we need to be talking about whole numbers of people. And right, you'd need 2 people to make sure you could cover 160. Here, scratch work, 1,000 divided by 160. Round that up. The second month we're going to be busier. My calculator reveals we need 7. Then here 300 divided by 160, but you have to round up. We're back to needing 2 people. The 4th month, 1,200 divided by 160, round up. That's that busy month, and you do need 8 people to cover that in regular time. And then 600 divided by 160, we would need 4 people to cover that. This is the implementation if you vary the size of the workforce exactly. Determine the total cost. My example is only using 2 options, and in general, if you're doing something like this, I say make yourself a worksheet. Again, it's kind of like an invoice. What should you charge yourself for? Well, I should charge myself for using regular time. Holding any inventory? No, not holding any inventory. Overtime? No, there's no overtime here. The only thing that I'm doing is I'm varying the size of the workforce. So I know that, and I'm writing the words first, I'm going to have a hiring cost. And I know that I'm going to have workforce reduction costs as well. So first I just write the words. Then I figure out what the charges would be. Regular time, let me go back and consult. Cost of producing 1 unit in regular time, $15. How many units am I producing in regular time? Just add them all up. They're all being produced in regular time. That's what the spreadsheet's doing if you put those numbers under regular time times that $15. So my regular time charge, I get $49,500. Hiring. Okay, I need to look this over and figure out how many times I actually hire somebody. We'll have 2 people in the first month and then 7 people in the second month, right? So right away, that is an instance of hiring 5 people. This is just logic. It's not really a formula. Okay, so I'm going to be hiring 5 people here. Then from the second month to the third month, I'm going to be reducing the size of the workforce, so that's not hiring. But from the third month to the fourth month, I hire 2 up to 8. I hire another 6 people, right? Okay, got to remember that. And then, okay, the rest of that is not hiring. That is reducing the size of the workforce. So what was that, the number of hires? 5 plus 6 hires. A total of 11 hires if you follow this plan. And what was the cost? Increasing the workforce by 1, $500 each for onboarding. So I get, what did I get? 5,500. Layoffs, very, very similar, right? Here, nope, that's not laying off. Oh, wait a minute, from 7 to 2, that is, right? And then from 2 to 8, nope, that is not reducing the size of the workforce. But from 8 to 4, yeah, that is, unfortunately, laying off 4 people. And there's another instance of that here. Anybody see where it is? I accounted for that reduction and that one. But I wrote it in ink. There's another instance of it. Everybody see it? Yeah, don't forget, they told us what the initial size of the workforce was. So that counts. So there's 7. And the plan is starting out with 2. So that's what this other 5 is. You have to pay for that transition. How much do you pay? It said 700. So I get 9,800. I have accounted for the 3 things that I have spent money on. That, and this to determine the total cost of the plan. You just add them together, right? So I get 6,480. Assuming that we're back to the original statement of the problem where we started, because I didn't include any charge for idle time of the people that we have. So going forth in life, one hopes that you, and we would think, have the benefit of working with a spreadsheet model. But generally speaking, if you're tackling one of these scenarios, that's the set of steps. First, you have to pick a strategy. What am I going to test? Or kind of at a practical level, a lot of times, to build up ability with this, a strategy is suggested to you, like in a practice problem. So the next thing you have to do is actually implement it to see what it would look like. If it's using certain options, okay, when are the options used and to what degree? Why are you doing that? Because, right, it's down below here on the paper, because then you figure out what you're spending on each one of the options. Why? Because you add all that up for one total cost. You're declaring that the value of this particular plan. Why are you doing that? Well, maybe because it was a practice problem. In real life, why are you doing that? Because then you're going to see if you can find a plan that's better than that one. And if you can't, then you're going to use it. Make sense? Okay, aggregate planning problems, just both in real life and when you're studying them, they involve a lot of detail, generally speaking. But it's all logic. It's just about staying organized. Okay. Here's the plan, here's how we'll do it, then I'll figure out what we spent, and then that's the total cost. Alrighty. I think there's an example of something like that. Yeah. Oh, interesting. It's a very old exam problem, just so that you have them for your own reference. Those are the correct answers. This is an aggregate planning problem. You can definitely tell because it's giving you a forecast of demand, but notice that this particular problem gives you the plan. It gives you the plan, so it's obviously asking you to assess it. These other ones are one-off kind of questions. See what I mean about being careful about ending versus average inventory? Because everything that we were doing with that problem that we were just working on was in ending inventory. And another thing about level schedule. Okay, so those are some really old problems. Okay. Well, that brings us to, I just turned the page. It says no page 113. Material requirements planning. Yeah, I told you we could safely start on that. But maybe we should back out for a second. We'll put away our aggregate spreadsheet model, go back to the slides, and let's talk about this transition. Because you can see where on the slides, I clipped from the footers of the note pages. The title of the chapter is Aggregate and Material Requirements Planning, two different topics. Two different topics that are obviously together in a large chapter because one leads into the other. All right, but what is this connection? All right, well, it's all in that one key word, which I think we stumbled across before. The idea of independent demand. Aggregate planning concerns independent demand. Now, this is the keyword definition for independent demand. Requirements for an item from outside the system. Generally known, like we're talking, as customer demand, right? What are the projected sales going to be? What are the customers going to want? What will we need to provide and when? That was that whole business about there was a string of numbers and that was the forecast. And the forecast was the overall demand on the system. Right. And so in aggregate planning, you're confronted with that, and then you figure out in terms of general production or provision levels how you're going to handle that. How you're going to handle that independent demand. Okay, now, independent demand has a sibling. It has a twin. See where this is headed? Now that you have an aggregate plan, you become concerned about dependent demand. Now, this is something, independent demand, we have seen a bunch of times before, this idea of customer demand and planning for it. Okay, dependent demand, this is kind of the first time during the semester that this has cropped up. Now, formal definition of it, requirement for what child items? Yeah, hang on to that thought. We'll talk about that term. But probably easiest to remember as component demand. You're like, what? Okay. Let's suppose, and this is just like this most stereotypical textbook example. Suppose we are an automotive manufacturer. So if we're like the big names, Toyota, Ford, GM, we really like level schedules. Oh, by the way, because this will come up again, we really like level schedules at our assembly plants. So much so, have you guys ever noticed or talked to anybody that special ordered a vehicle? You know, you go into a dealership, you say, oh, well, I want to buy a brand new vehicle, and I don't want any one of the ones that you have on the lot right now, right? Oh, but oh, yes, please come in, sit down, right? Let's talk about it. Let's make your dream vehicle. Yes, well, oh, yes, I want this option, I want that option, I want that option, I want that option. They're delighted to draw up the order that's going to go to an assembly plant for that vehicle. When's that vehicle going to be ready? When are you actually going to pick up that dream vehicle? It's going to be a while, usually. They usually say, oh, that's great. Here, put down a deposit, and here's the contract, and it'll be 6 or 8 weeks. I'm spending tens of thousands of dollars with you, right? Your plants, your assembly plants, are pushing out these vehicles at a constant rate every day, and it's going to be 6 to 8 weeks before they put together my vehicle. And the reason is yes, because they love following perfectly level plans, and we will come back to this little story. There's something about perfectly level plans that you have to protect, and they're protecting their level plan by telling you that it's going to be a while. They're not going to drop everything and put it in the build sequence right away. Okay, we'll come back to that. But stereotypical example of dependent demand, let's say we're at the actual assembly plant. Because we have decided on the aggregate plan that we will, and I'm just making up numbers, produce 1,000 cars every week, right? That's the aggregate plan, just vehicles. We're going to be working steady for the next 50 weeks, making 1,000 vehicles a week. Because we decided that, we now need 4,000 tires every week, right? Vehicle has 4 tires on it. That's dependent demand. The independent demand was the finished vehicles. We're assuming that somebody's hopefully purchasing these, right? We've decided to make them 1,000 a week. Because we decided to make them 1,000 a week, there is dependent demand now for, among many, many, many other things, 4,000 tires a week. 1,000 times 4. Oh, right. Among many, many, many other things. Because if we really were assembling 1,000 vehicles a week, we'd have a lot of other component materials that we'd now start needing to plan for. Material requirements planning is a style of inventory management. Remember, all of inventory management is just how much should I order of that and when should I order it. It's a particular style of inventory management that is specifically meant to handle issues of dependent demand. Oh, okay. So we have our aggregate plan. Now we're going to plan to support the aggregate plan. What is it that we need to do that? You'll start to notice after a week or two that there's a bit of history developing here. Material requirements planning, if you're a buff, you can argue that its early days, it was invented in, say, the 1940s and the 1950s. It really gained popularity in the 1980s. It is alive and well today. When it sort of burst into popularity, that is how it was essentially advertised by consultants. Setting up a system to get you the right part at the right time. Remember how much and when? You know what it really is? It's essentially an information system. It is an inventory management technique, but when you work a full-blown MRP problem, you are essentially implementing a small information system. That information system, whether you're working a problem or whether you're actually setting up a material requirements planning system for a company, you're going to need three things at the very, very beginning. We start with these three things. One of them, bill of materials, you'll notice that I jotted on the agenda. It basically tells you how do you produce what you produce. I mean, loosely speaking, that's why I'm putting it in quotes. You said, what is a bill of materials? That is a document. It's usually electronic. Open it up, and it tells you how to put together what it is you produce. That is to say, it's a statement of dependent demand. Because in my simplistic example, if you opened up the bill of materials for an automobile, it's going to include, among other things, a statement that you are going to need 4 tires before we're finished. That is the statement of the dependent demand that's created. A master production schedule, that's a document. How much of what do you want to finish? And when? Oh, wait a minute. How much and of what do you want to finish? Why would you, the producer, want to finish anything? Well, one assumes because you can make money by selling it. That means that your master production schedule is a statement of independent demand, right? The customer demand. The bill of materials tells you the component demand. The master production schedule tells you the independent demand. Oh, and then there's this third thing, current inventory records. That is exactly what it sounds like. If you want to get started on this, you also need this. This is just a resource. You need some sort of file, some screen you can pull up, some table that tells you how much of what you have right now. And again, I'm putting in quotes, right, because we're just keeping this conversational. But that is what current inventory records are. Okay, how much do we have right now? What do we have to work with right now? What do we have to work with right now, given that this is what we want to do, right, and this is how we do it? That's another way to think of these three things. All right, now, of these, we can talk a little bit about this one later. But it's basically a document. That's just your. This is actually from your aggregate plan. There's the link. The master production schedule. Because how much of what do you want to finish and when? Remember the production levels in the aggregate plan? I should note something, though, before we go any further. We can talk about this a little bit later, but it's basically the output of aggregate planning, except, do you see how there's a thumbnail down here, disaggregation? Okay. There is something that we're kind of glossing over. The results of your careful aggregate planning, when you figure out what the lowest cost aggregate plan is like for the next 6 months or the next 8 months, they don't plug into the material requirements planning system exactly. Some work has to be done first, just a little bit of translation. Well, what? Doesn't it answer that question? Yes, but why is it called aggregate planning? Do you notice when you're picking strategies and making broad decisions about options, you're always just planning for one thing? Yeah, that's what's called aggregate planning. You know, any given vehicle assembly plant will actually make a wide variety of models of vehicles, automobiles. But when we do the aggregate planning for the assembly plant, we don't bother with the different model types. We just generalize them, aggregate them all together in terms of vehicles, right? Sherwin-Williams can have a plant that produces paints. I'm just trying to grab like another well-known brand name. Right, and that plant will actually produce many different colors and different types of paint. When they're doing aggregate planning for the plant, though, they won't bother to plan those details. They'll just pick some gallons of product and plan for that. Now, we still have to plan for the different colors and types of paint. We do. But what we're going to do is we're going to do it in between the aggregate plan and the master production schedule, That's what disaggregation is. After you've done all that hard work on aggregate planning, somebody has to sit down with your aggregate plan and they have to disaggregate it. They have to say, all right, you're planning 1,000 vehicles a month, so that means that we'd better break that down into like 225 model A21, 200 of model A23, and then they figure out the details. This is actually a very difficult phase, and it needs to be done well. This is the type of thing that you talk more about in an advanced class in operations because it's not easily done. What we're doing in MGO302 is just noting that there's somebody working very, very hard doing that, right? And so they will produce from the aggregate plan a more specific set of requests of what we want to finish and when. It will recognize all the different models. Oh, all right. But anyway, so this is just a fact. This is just records of everything on this page that I'm gesturing to. The one thing that's the most, loosely speaking, exotic in that we kind of haven't been here before is the bill of materials. The bill of materials before we set up and work an MRP problem, the bill of materials is something we should spend just a little bit of time with all by itself to make sure that we understand that input and all the lingo, the language that surrounds that specifically. That's the one thing that we haven't really seen before. Oh, all right. So the best way to talk about the bill of materials is to have a product that requires a bill of materials. That is to say, a product that there's a recipe. That's in quotes, very loosely speaking, but if you want another way of kind of remembering or understanding what a bill of materials is, think of it as a recipe, the recipe for the product. We've got one in the note pack for the purpose of demonstration. It is essentially an anecdotal bill of materials because the only thing when you turn the page here, note page 114, the only thing that you see is just 2 paragraphs. It's just a story. Okay. Well, first let's take a look at the story and then let's talk about how we might draw this up as a more formal bill of materials. Your company assembles 2 product lines. All right, so right away we're seeing that there's finished goods because that's where the story begins with any bill of materials, and it sounds like there's 2 of them. Something is called transaxle, something called turnstile. Typical transaxle consists of 3 yellow wheels, a red rod, a blue rod, and a green bearing. The 2 yellow wheels and the green bearing are, remember I told you it was a story, are joined together with the red rod to create a so-called axle subassembly. The 3rd yellow wheel is welded to the end of the blue rod to create a transmission subassembly. And then it looks like, oh, wait a minute. Those sound familiar? What do I need? 3 yellow wheels, right? Red rod, blue rod, green bearing. 2 yellow wheels and the green bearing here are joined together to create a axle subassembly. 3rd yellow wheel welded to the end of the blue rod to create a transmission subassembly. So looks like that. 2 subassemblies joined together. There's the finished product. Anybody recognize what these actually are? What is this? I'll make another one. This is not a child's toy. Okay? I know that you guys probably can't see it who are watching on video, but I carry these around in what looks like a portfolio that just holds documents. So that when I'm in the hallway, it's not readily apparent to like other professors that what are these? Does anybody remember what these are called? They're still fairly popular. Yeah, Tinker something. Yeah, Tinker Toys. Yeah, okay. All right. But we want to practice this before we go any further. Yes, you can see, you can't see where it says Play School. You know, it's the brand name here. Right. No, these are not child's toys. This is a physical model of a discrete part assembly process. Did everybody hear that? It is a physical model. I've got it up front there to work with of a discrete part, this part, that part, that part, a discrete part assembly process. It's not Tinker Toys. I was once traveling with these because I was teaching abroad a workshop, and I actually got pulled in customs because they saw them on the x-ray. And I don't know why, but that set off some sort of alarms, and they went into my luggage and they actually pulled these things out. And they had pulled me to the side and asked me where I was going and what I was doing. In the meantime, I didn't understand what the delay was about. And then when they realized it was Tinker Toys, I had already told them, truthfully, that I was a professor for the University of Buffalo and that I had been teaching an executive workshop and that I was returning back to Buffalo, New York via, it was like JFK or something like that. They pulled out the Tinker Toys, yes. They were very disappointed. I don't know what they thought that they were. And the guy turns to me and he says, "You're a professor? You mean like college?" Yes. So that's why, that's why I'm always very careful to make sure everybody understands that I find that MRP, what we're going to do is we're going to add a lot of logic to this, and then it's going to turn into some calculations. I find that it's easiest for most people if there is something literal that we start with. This is our model of the literal. And that is also why, instead of using the original box, I carry them around now in a portfolio. Now, that was actually only one of the mythical finished products, right? Because that's that top paragraph. This is a transaxle. Now, what does the other one say? A typical turnstile consists of a blue wheel. We need another yellow wheel. We need 4 red rods. Now they're starting to get away up here at the teaching station. And an orange washer and another blue rod. So orange washer, there's that, and blue rod. Why? The 4 red rods are fixed to the blue wheel to create a top subassembly. Oh, the top subassembly looks like this. 4 red rods fixed to blue wheel. Got it. And then what are we supposed to do? The 4 red rods, okay, did that one. Oh, wait a minute, we've seen this before. The yellow wheel and the blue rod are welded together to create that same transmission subassembly that we saw in the first one, right? When these 2 subassemblies are linked with the addition of the orange washer, oh, that's how that works. Put the orange washer here. We have a second mythical finished good, the turnstile. Now, I have described to you 2 different bills of material. They're related, but it's 2 different products anecdotally, right? We're just playing with the Tinker Toys and putting them together. Now what we want to do is examine a much more formal and fail-safe way of describing exactly that. Now, there are gaps in here for you to sketch, right? You could attempt this whole time to, what would that look like? Oh, there were like these wheels, and then there was a bearing, and there was another one. But you don't have to rely on that. I just wanted to point something out. If you go to the computer, and to UB Learns, is it still open? Yes, we don't need this document. Let me close it. But let's go back to Documents. Let's go to that one folder where I stow everything. Right now, down to the very bottom, because things have been emerging all semester. No, page 114, that's where we're at, right? I did that for you. Okay, that was to the best of my ability. You can retrieve that for the blank space, in between the 2 scenarios. Here's the turnstile. Oh, and we have some additional language that we're already attaching to it if you can read my handwriting. Because, for instance, the transaxle is the finished good. Yeah, we knew that. Wait a minute. Going back to chapter 10, because I told you these things are from chapter 10 all the way through chapter 12, 13. They're all woven together. If you think about it, the business about the 2 halves, the transmission and the axle, that's work in process. It's implying that you could make those separately, and then use them. So that makes them work in process, because the way from what little information you've been given in those short little paragraphs, the story apparently begins with the Tinker Toy parts that I smuggled into class. They're basically our physical model of raw materials. This is because it's where the story starts. Same thing, I'm standing in front of it. Do you see the same pattern with the turnstile? Start with some parts. I was pulling them out of the portfolio. Make the two halves. Those are sub-assemblies. That's work in process. Why? Because those all come together and make the finished good. Now, why am I noting this? Because these are going to become important navigation points later on. The raw materials, the work in process, and the finished goods. We're essentially going to set up a system that simultaneously coordinates across this whole flow. That's what material requirements planning is. Oh, right, planning for the materials that you're going to need at all levels. Okay, so we have our product. We've discussed anecdotally how it's produced, but we haven't looked at our first formal bill of materials. I'm looking at the clock. There's 10 minutes left in class. There's kind of enough time to do one of them, but not both of them. So I'm thinking that maybe we'll just stop here. All right, we know how to build it because we talked about it. And starting on Tuesday, then let's draw up the actual bill of materials for the two. That make sense? Okay, thanks. Have a good weekend. Oh, wait a minute. No, wait, this is Tuesday. I'm sorry. I had I worked all weekend, and it's made me a little brainless. Right? See you Thursday. That's what we'll do on Thursday. Duh.